Millionaire father decided to visit his daughter in the hope of seeing her again. But when he opened the door, he saw something that made him despair. The lights of the Harrington mansion cast an opaque glow over the perfectly trimmed gardens. Sitting in his leather armchair in the study, Daniel stared at the fireplace with his eyes lost in a past he had never been able to bury. In his hands was a picture frame, its golden color worn away by time. The photograph showed Abigail at the age of 10, her blonde hair loose and her smile radiant, holding a school medal of honor. "She was so brilliant," murmured Daniel, the sound of his own voice echoing through the empty room. The memory of their last conversation felt like a knife in his chest. He could still hear Abigail, aged 18, her eyes welling with tears. "You don't understand, Dad. I don't want your money. I want you." But back then, all Daniel could see was a young woman challenging his authority. Her harsh words echoed in his memory like a sentence. "Then go live without my money. I want to see how far you get without it." Abigail left that very night, and Daniel never looked for her. Years passed. He heard from afar that she was fine, living in Springfield, but he never bothered to call or visit her. Pride and stubbornness had always been greater, until now. Regret came little by little, like drops forming an ocean. The first blow came when his business partner and longtime friend Arthur suffered a massive heart attack. At that funeral, Daniel heard Arthur's daughter talk about how he had always been a present father, even at the height of his work. The second blow was deeper. A recent medical report brought news he hadn't expected. His health was no longer the same. The years of non-stop work and stress were beginning to take their toll. Daniel found himself alone, with no one to share his anguish with, and realized that the fortune he had fought so hard to build was worthless without Abigail. It was then that he found her letter, tucked away among piles of papers he had never read. Each word felt like a silent cry, a belated invitation to mend what had been broken. And now there he was, in the seat of a luxury car driving the winding roads to Springfield. The rain began to fall, heavy and relentless, as if the universe wanted to wash away the sins of his soul. He had never set foot in that town before, but he knew exactly where Abigail lived. He had hired investigators years ago to keep an eye on her from a distance, although he had never had the courage to act. When he arrived, he parked his car in front of a modest house with a small garden that looked as if it had been tended with dedication. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling his hands shaking. He didn't know what to say, or if she would listen. Maybe Abigail didn't even want to see him. Maybe she had forgotten him. The rain beat heavily on the roof of the car as he hesitated. Finally, he mustered the courage he needed and got out, walking to the door. Each step seemed to weigh a ton. He raised his hand and knocked 3 times. "Abigail?" His voice was lower than he expected, almost a whisper. There was no reply. He waited a few seconds, but silence greeted him. He tried again, this time more forcefully. "Abigail, it's me, your father. Can we talk?" Then he heard it. From inside the house, a muffled, high-pitched sound, almost like a scream. Daniel froze, his heart racing. "Abigail?" he called again, his voice now full of urgency. No answer. He tried to turn the handle, but the door was locked. Daniel felt despair begin to take hold. Something was wrong. He knocked hard, but everything remained silent, except for the rain that insisted on falling. That sound, that wasn't normal. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. "Abigail, I'm coming in," he warned, more to himself than to her. With an impulse, he pushed the door open with his shoulder, feeling the wood give way under the force. The room was dark and silent, except for the echo of the rain outside. The air seemed heavy, charged with something he couldn't identify. Daniel entered cautiously, calling his daughter's name again. As he took another step inside, something caught his eye. He stopped and widened his eyes, and then absolute silence. Before continuing this story, please leave your like and comment on which city you're talking about. I want to know how far this video has gone. The room was filled with the sound of Daniel's heavy breathing, mixed with the incessant drumming of the rain. He looked around, confused, trying to understand what had happened there. The place seemed so silent, and yet so full of a strange energy. Then he noticed a puddle of water was spreading across the living room floor, reflecting the dim lights coming from a lamp. At first he thought it was rain, but he realized it was coming from another direction, from the corridor that led to the bedrooms and bathroom. He advanced down the corridor with hesitant steps, his hands shaking slightly. The muffled sound of a moan reached his ears, faint, almost like a whisper lost in the rain. Daniel's heart raced, and he practically ran to the bathroom door. It was ajar. He pushed it carefully, his heart racing, and what he saw on the other side brought him to a standstill. There, lying on the cold floor, was Abigail. She was curled up on her side, her hair messy and her skin pale. Her clothes were wet, and a puddle was forming around her. It was then that Daniel understood what was happening. She was moaning in pain, clutching her belly with both hands. "Dad," Abigail managed to say, her voice almost a breath. "Please, help." Daniel's heart almost stopped. His daughter was pregnant, and the bag had burst. He remained motionless for a few seconds, her words resonating in his mind like a distant echo. Finally, he knelt down beside her, feeling the gravity of the situation envelop him completely. "Abigail, my God, I'm going to get you out of here, okay? Let's go to the hospital," he said, his voice full of nervousness as he tried to help her up. She just shook her head, groaning. "I can't. It hurts too much." Daniel swallowed, feeling the tension grow by the second. He was used to high-pressure situations in business meetings, but nothing had prepared him for this. He had no idea how to act. "Why haven't you told me anything? Why are you alone?" he asked, as he carefully lifted her, his arms trembling with the effort of lifting her weight and the guilt that seemed to crush him at the same time. Abigail let out a shaky sigh and murmured, I didn't want you to see me like this." Those words hit Daniel like a knife. He knew it wasn't just about the pregnancy. Abigail had always been strong, independent, but now she was vulnerable, in need of help, and he wasn't there for her when she needed him most. He carried her out of the house, ignoring the rain that was now drenching them. The icy water fell like needles on his face, but all that mattered was getting Abigail into the car and to the hospital as quickly as possible. He opened the door of the back seat and carefully settled her in. "Hold on tight, daughter. I'll take care of you," he said, trying to sound confident, although the nervousness was clear in his voice. As he drove through the flooded streets, Daniel couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror, watching Abigail struggle with the pain. Her every moan sounded like a silent accusation, reminding him of all the times he hadn't been there. "Abigail, you don't have to talk now, but please tell me, where is the father of this child?" he asked, his voice hesitant. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath before answering. "He left me when he found out about the pregnancy. He said he didn't want the responsibility. He drank a lot. It wasn't good for me." Daniel gripped the steering wheel so hard that his knuckles turned white. The idea that someone had abandoned his daughter in that situation consumed him with anger, but also with guilt. He wondered if Abigail had chosen that man because she felt so alone and neglected by him. "Why didn't you come to me? I would have helped," he said, his voice full of pain. "You? Dad, you've never been there. Why should it be any different now?" Abigail groaned in pain and collapsed there in the car. Her words hit him hard. He had no way of arguing. Abigail was right. He had walked away, and now he was reaping the consequences. When he realized that Abigail had collapsed, he sped up even more. It was a very tense situation, and he knew that something inside him changed at that moment. He knew he couldn't undo the mistakes of the past, but he could still be present now, and all he wanted most at that moment was to save the lives of his daughter and the baby. Finally, they arrived at the hospital. Daniel parked the car anyway and ran to get help. Nurses and doctors came immediately with a stretcher, and he watched heart in hand as Abigail was wheeled in. As he waited in the waiting room, soaking wet and alone, Daniel began to think back to all the times Abigail had tried to get back together. Letters, phone calls, messages that he had ignored because he thought he had time. Now, sitting there, with the possibility of losing both his daughter and grandson, he realized how empty his life had become without her. A nurse approached, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Mr. Harrington, your daughter is stable now, but we need you to fill out some paperwork." He nodded quickly, getting up. "The baby, is everything going to be okay? It's a complicated labor, but the doctors are doing everything they can. You can wait here, but I promise we'll keep you informed." Daniel thanked her, but his heart couldn't find peace. He sat down again, his hands shaking slightly. The rain continued to fall outside, as if the whole world was sharing his pain and uncertainty. He closed his eyes for a moment, praying for the first time in years. "Abigail, please be all right. I can't lose you now," he murmured, the words coming out like a desperate prayer. The next few hours would be crucial, not only for Abigail and the baby's life, but also for Daniel. The weight was unbearable, and he knew that, whatever happened, his life would never be the same. The rain continued to fall heavily, creating a dull, heavy sound against the hospital windows. Daniel Harrington was sitting in an uncomfortable chair in the waiting room, his face marked by tiredness and the weight of his emotions. The place was simple, too small by the standards he was used to, but now all that mattered was what happened beyond that double door, where his daughter struggled with pain and uncertainty. The nurse's words echoed in his mind. "It's a complicated labor." He knew that meant there were risks, but what were they? How long would it take? And above all, would his daughter and grandson be all right? Daniel was not a religious man, but at that moment he found himself praying, silently, with his hands clasped together and his eyes fixed on the floor. As he waited, flashes of memories haunted him. He remembered the last time he had held Abigail in his arms. She was 6 years old, a little tornado of energy and curiosity. That day she had fallen off her bike and hurt her knee. Daniel carried her into the house and looked after her, promising that he would always be there to protect her, a promise that, looking back, he hadn't kept. "Mr. Harrington," called a soft voice. Daniel raised his head, looking at the nurse in front of him. She had a professional smile on her face, but her eyes carried concern. "Your daughter is being taken to the operating room. The baby needs to be delivered now." "Surgery?" he repeated, the word cutting through the air like a blade. "Yes, the baby's condition requires an emergency cesarean section. You can wait here or, if you prefer, you can accompany us to the operating room corridor." Daniel nodded quickly, following the nurse without hesitation. His shoes echoed across the cold hospital floor, and his heart beat faster with every step. When they reached the corridor, he saw Abigail being wheeled in on a stretcher. Her eyes were half closed, her face contorted with pain. Even in that state, she turned her head towards him. "Dad," she murmured, her voice weak but charged with emotion. "I'm here, Abigail. I'm here, child," he replied, his voice breaking as he tried to hold back tears. She smiled slightly before closing her eyes again. The doctors and nurses disappeared with her behind a door marked with large letters, "Surgical Center." Daniel stood there staring at the door as if his whole life depended on what happened on the other side. He returned to the waiting room, the silence of the place only amplifying the deafening noise of his thoughts. His world seemed to be falling apart. For years he had justified his absence with excuses. "I'm working for her. She'll understand one day. I'll see her when things settle down." Now, none of that mattered. He felt like a stranger, an intruder in his own daughter's life. A doctor entered the room, snapping Daniel out of his daydreams. The man had a serious, slow expression, which did nothing to calm his nerves. "Mr. Harrington," the doctor called out, approaching. Daniel stood up quickly, almost stumbling. "Yes, how is she? And the baby? Are they all right?" "The surgery has started well. Your daughter is being monitored, but there are complications. She lost a lot of amniotic fluid before she got here, and this caused a small case of fetal distress. We're doing our best to make sure they're both okay, but we'll need to act quickly." Daniel felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The word suffering echoed in his head like an incessant bell. Will she survive?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "We're optimistic, but Mr. Harrington, everything depends on how her body reacts during the next moments of the surgery. We ask you to be patient and to trust our team." Patience. How could he be patient when his daughter was in such a state? He thanked the doctor and sat down again, but the agony of waiting consumed him. The minutes passed slowly, each second seeming like an eternity. Then he noticed something. In his coat pocket he found Abigail's broken cell phone, the same one he had picked up at her house. He decided to turn it on, hoping it would still work. After a few tries, the device vibrated and, to his surprise, the screen lit up. On the phone there were archived messages, most of them unanswered. Daniel hesitated for a moment before opening the most recent conversation. It was with someone called Josh, and the messages were short and cold. "You need help with this. I told you it's over, Josh. It's not that simple." Those words made no sense to Daniel. Who was that man? He squinted, trying to find more clues, but a notification popped up on the screen. The battery was running out. Before he could do anything, the device went off, leaving him with more questions than answers. He got up and started walking down the corridor, trying to process everything that was happening. Why had Abigail never come to him? Why did she face all this alone? When did she decide that he was no longer part of her life? These thoughts were interrupted when the nurse returned to the corridor. She had a neutral expression, but her eyes were undeniably worried. "Mr. Harrington, your daughter is stable, but there have been complications with the baby. He was born with difficulty breathing and has been taken to the neonatal ICU. We're doing everything we can." Daniel felt his legs failing him, and he had to lean on the wall to keep from falling. "Can I see her, Abigail?" "Yes, but she's still recovering from the anesthesia. Please follow me." He followed her into the room, his heart heavy and full of uncertainty. When he entered, he saw Abigail lying down, her eyes closed, strands of hair sticking to her forehead from sweat. She looked so fragile, so different from the lively girl he remembered. He reached over and took her hand, feeling the weight of all the decisions that had led him there. "I'm here, Abigail. I'm not going anywhere. Forgive me for not being the father you deserved." Abigail opened her eyes slowly, blinking a few times before focusing on him. A faint smile appeared on her lips. "Dad, is he all right?" Daniel felt a knot forming in his throat. He didn't know what to say, but he forced himself to be honest. "He's struggling, child, but he's in good hands." Tears streamed down Abigail's face, and Daniel couldn't stop his own from falling too. There, in that moment, he made a silent promise. No matter what happened, he would be there. For the first time in his life, he would be the father she had always needed. And as the sound of the monitors filled the silence of the room, Daniel knew that his journey of redemption was just beginning. The hospital room was small, lit by a pale, cold light that barely disguised the weight of the emotions that hung in the air. Daniel sat next to Abigail, her fragile hand in his, as he tried to control the storm of feelings inside him. His heart was heavy, full of regrets accumulated over the years. Abigail was awake, but visibly exhausted. Her eyes, once so bright and full of determination, were watery and fixed on the ceiling. She barely spoke, and Daniel knew that her mind was elsewhere, on the baby who was now fighting for life in the neonatal ICU. "Dad," she murmured, breaking the silence. Daniel leaned closer, as if her every word was a precious thing he couldn't afford to lose. "Yes, child, I'm here." She turned her face slowly towards him, her eyes shining with tears. "Is he going to be all right? My son. I don't know what I'd do if something happened to him." The knot in Daniel's throat tightened even more. He wanted to give a guarantee, a promise that everything would be all right. But the truth was that he didn't know. Instead, he squeezed her hand tighter. "Abigail, you created this little miracle all by yourself. You're stronger than anyone I've ever met. He's as strong as you. Go fight." The tears finally fell from her eyes, and Daniel gently wiped them away, feeling a mixture of pain and tenderness. He still couldn't believe that Abigail had gone through all this alone. "Why didn't you come to me, child?" he asked softly, as if he feared the answer. Abigail let out a heavy sigh, as if carrying those memories was a weight she didn't know how to share. "Because you were never there, Dad. Even when I was little, even when you were close. You were never really there. I learned not to expect anything from you." Her words were like daggers, but he knew they were true. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the guilt crush him even more. I know I failed you, Abigail, and I know that no excuse can change that. But I'm here now, and I promise I'll never let you face anything alone again." She turned her face away, as if she didn't know if she could believe him, but said nothing. The tension in the air was so palpable that Daniel almost didn't notice when the door opened. A nurse walked in, her face serious but trying to remain calm. "Miss Harrington," she called out, looking at Abigail. "Mr. Harrington can stay here if you like, but we need to talk about the baby's condition." Abigail tried to sit up, but her body was still too weak. Daniel, sensing her difficulty, helped her adjust herself on the bed. He felt the weight of her gaze as the nurse continued. "The baby is stable, but there are still complications. He was born prematurely, and his lungs are not yet fully developed. We're administering respiratory support, and he'll respond to treatment over time. But—" The nurse paused, which made Abigail and Daniel's hearts freeze. "He's at risk of infection. We've done preliminary tests and we need to monitor him closely over the next 48 hours. This period will be crucial." Abigail covered her face with her hands, sobbing softly. Daniel, not knowing exactly what to do, put his hand on her shoulder. The nurse remained silent for a few moments before leaving the room, leaving father and daughter alone. Daniel wanted to say something, anything, but he didn't know how. He had always known how to communicate in meetings, in front of audiences of investors, but in the face of his own daughter's suffering, words left him. "Dad, I feel like this is all my fault." The statement snapped him out of his thoughts, and he looked at her in surprise. "Don't say that, Abigail, it's not your fault." "But it is," she exclaimed, her voice breaking. "I chose badly. I chose a man who was worthless. I knew he drank, that he couldn't be trusted, but I still stayed. I thought he would change for me, for us. And when he left me, I thought I could do everything on my own. But now, what if my son doesn't survive? What if he pays for my mistakes?" Daniel felt his heart clench. He knelt beside her bed, holding her hands tightly. "Daughter, listen to me. You're not to blame for any of this. You did the best you could in a situation that no father, not even I, prepared you to face. You were strong, Abigail, much stronger than I've ever been, but now you don't have to carry it all alone. I'm here, and we'll face it together." Abigail looked at him, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes, a tiny spark that maybe she didn't have to fight alone. The door opened again, this time with the doctor entering. He looked tired, but his expression was reassuring. "Miss Harrington, your son is showing signs of improvement. We're still a long way from the end, but he's responding well to respiratory support." The words brought immediate relief. Abigail began to cry with relief, and Daniel sighed as if he had been holding his breath for hours. "Can I see him?" asked Abigail, her voice weak but determined. The doctor nodded. "Of course, but only for a few minutes. He's in the incubator and needs intensive care, but it will be good for him to hear your voice." Daniel helped Abigail into a wheelchair, and together they made their way down the corridors to the neonatal ICU. As they entered, the sound of monitors and machines filled the air. Abigail took a deep breath, and her eyes immediately fixed on the little body in the incubator. He was so small, so fragile, but he was there, fighting. Abigail reached out a trembling hand, gently touching the glass. "Hi, my love. Mommy's here," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Daniel stood behind her, watching the scene with a heavy heart. He never imagined his life would come to this, but there he was, with the chance to be part of his daughter's life and now his grandson's. "He'll be fine, Abigail. He has your spirit," he said, trying to give her strength. Abigail turned to him, tears still falling but with a small smile. "Thank you, Dad, for being here, and especially for saving our lives. If you hadn't come to the house at that time, I can't imagine what would have happened." And at that moment, Daniel realized that for the first time in a long time there was a chance of redemption. The road would be long, full of challenges, but he was willing to face every one of them. He couldn't change the past, but he would do everything to ensure that the future for Abigail and her grandson would be different. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in years, Daniel felt he had something to fight for. The silence of the neonatal ICU was broken only by the rhythmic sound of the machines that kept little miracles alive. Abigail lay motionless in the wheelchair, her eyes fixed on her son. Her fingers trembled against the glass of the incubator as she gazed at the baby so small, so fragile, connected to tubes that seemed to swallow his little body. "I never thought it would be like this," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the sterile environment. Daniel, standing behind her, crossed his arms and bowed his head. He didn't know how to respond. He wanted to say something that would take away Abigail's pain, but nothing he could say could erase the years he had been away, or the choices that had forced her to face life alone. "Dad," Abigail began, without taking her eyes off the baby, "I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to be a mother. And now, he's fighting for his life. And I feel so weak." Daniel knelt down beside her, taking her hand between his. "Abigail, you're the strongest person I've ever met. You've carried this child alone, you've faced things I can't even imagine, but now you're not alone anymore. I'm here. I know I wasn't before, but I am now, and I'm not going anywhere." Abigail slowly turned to look at him. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but there was an intensity in them that Daniel couldn't ignore. "Why now, Dad? After all this time? Why did you come? What's changed?" The question hit him like a blow. He knew this conversation was inevitable, but he hadn't expected it to come right then and there. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the words he needed to say. "Because I was wrong, Abigail. I thought that work, money, success, all that was what mattered. I thought I was building a future for both of us. But in reality, I was building a wall between us. I convinced myself that I was doing the right thing. But the truth was that I was scared. I didn't know how to be a father. I didn't know how to deal with you, with the pain you felt. So I walked away. It was easier to hide at work than face up to what was wrong." Abigail stared at him for a long moment. She wanted to believe him, but there were years of hurt between them that couldn't be erased with words. "You left me alone, Dad. You didn't even try. I tried. I wrote letters, I called, but you never answered. I had to learn to live without you. And I won't forgive myself for that," Daniel replied, his voice laced with emotion. "Abigail, I'm not here to ask you to forgive me now. I know it will take time, but I'm here for you and for my grandson. Please give me a chance to make it right." Before Abigail could reply, a nurse entered the room, interrupting the moment. "Miss Harrington, we need you to return to your room to rest. Your body is still recovering, and the baby will need you strong and healthy." Abigail looked at her son once more, touching the glass gently. "Mommy's here, my love. I'll do everything for you," she murmured, before allowing herself to be led back to her room with Daniel following in silence. In the bedroom, Abigail was settled on the bed, the pillows adjusted by a nurse who left shortly afterwards. The silence between father and daughter was heavy, full of unspoken things. Abigail finally broke the silence. "Do you know his name, Dad? I've already chosen it." Daniel frowned. "No, you never told me." "Liam," she replied, a small smile appearing on her lips. "It means protector. I thought it would be ironic, because he protected me from giving up. He gave me a purpose." Daniel felt a tightening in his chest. He knew that Liam was now Abigail's reason for fighting, but he also knew that she was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He needed to be strong for her. "Liam is a beautiful name," he said, taking a seat in the chair next to her bed, "and he's going to be a strong boy, just like his mother." Abigail laughed softly, but it sounded more like sadness than joy. "I hope he doesn't have to be that strong, Dad. I hope he has a different life from mine." Daniel held her hand again. "He will, because we're going to make sure of it together." The hours passed slowly. Daniel stayed by Abigail's side as she fell asleep, her expression finally relaxing. But he couldn't sleep. In his mind, the images of Abigail pregnant and struggling alone haunted him. He got up and walked to the window, looking out at the rain that was still falling. He thought of everything he had lost. Abigail was the only family he had, and he had wasted precious years. Now he had a second chance, but he didn't know if he would be able to win back her love and trust. While he was lost in thought, a doctor entered the room, calling him out. Daniel left discreetly, closing the door behind him. "The baby's condition is stable, Mr. Harrington, but he will still need intensive care for several weeks. I can't guarantee anything, but the signs we see now are promising." Daniel nodded, feeling a small sense of relief. "Thank you, doctor. Thank you for everything you're doing. If you want, you can visit him again. We know that family contact, however brief, makes a big difference to newborns in situations like this." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. He hesitated for a moment before replying, "Yes, I want to see him." The doctor led him back to the neonatal ICU, where Daniel was taken to the small incubator. There was Liam, connected to tubes and machines, but struggling. Daniel felt tears run down his face as he looked at his grandson. He put his hand on the glass, as Abigail had done earlier, and whispered, "Liam, you're a little fighter, you know that? And I'm going to fight for you, just like for your mother. I promise. I don't know if I can make up for everything I've done wrong, but I promise I'll do everything in my power to give you the life you deserve." The baby remained still, but Daniel felt a deep connection. He didn't know if Liam could hear him, but something inside him changed at that moment. He realized that there was no more room for excuses or regrets. There was only the future, and he was determined to be part of it. When he returned to the bedroom, Abigail was awake, staring at the door as if waiting for him. "You went to see him, didn't you?" Daniel nodded, sitting down next to her. Yes, he's incredible, Abigail. A real fighter. Abigail smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. Do you think he'll be all right, Dad? Daniel held her hand tightly. I know he will. And we'll be by his side every step of the way. For the first time, Abigail didn't respond with skepticism or hurt. She simply squeezed her father's hand back, allowing herself, even for a moment, to believe that he was telling the truth. And in that hospital room, under the pale, cold light, father and daughter began to rebuild something that had been lost a long time ago. The road would be long, full of challenges, but they were both ready to fight. After all, Liam needed them. And now more than ever, they needed each other. The first lights of morning were beginning to illuminate the hospital room when Daniel decided he needed to go out. He spent the whole night sitting in the armchair next to Abigail, watching his daughter sleep soundly after days of emotional and physical struggle. Every time he looked at her, he felt a mixture of love and guilt. She seemed so fragile, but Daniel knew that her inner strength was what had held everything together so far. When Abigail opened her eyes, she found her father fixing his suit. For a moment, her gaze was confused, but it quickly closed, hardening. Are you going out? Daniel stopped what he was doing, noticing the tone in her voice. He knew exactly what she was thinking. Years of abandonment had created a barrier between them, and it was impossible for Abigail not to hope that he would leave her again. Daughter, I need to sort out some important things. I promise I'll be back soon. I'm not going anywhere, he said, trying to sound reassuring. Abigail looked away, fiddling with the bedsheet. It's okay, Dad. I understand. You're good at sorting out important things. You always have been. Her words cut Daniel like a knife. He took a few steps towards her, sitting down on the edge of the bed. Look at me, Abigail. She hesitated, but finally raised her eyes to him. There was something in her eyes that completely disarmed him, an almost childlike fear of being left behind once again. I'm here now, and nothing is going to keep me from you. You have my word, he said, holding her hand firmly. I need to leave because I'm preparing something for you and Liam, but I'll be back before you know it. She shook her head slowly but didn't reply. Despite his words, it was hard to believe. All her life, Abigail had to get used to her father's absence. He'd say he'd come back, but he never did. So why should now be any different? Daniel kissed her on the forehead and left the room. Abigail watched him disappear down the corridor, and the door closed with a soft click. She looked at the white walls around her, feeling a familiar loneliness that wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. Of course he's gone, she muttered to herself, a solitary tear running down her cheek. I should be used to it by now. Outside, Daniel got into his car and took a deep breath. He knew Abigail was thinking the worst, but this time it would be different. He was going to prove to her that he was no longer the man who ran away from emotional responsibilities. He had something important to do, something that would show Abigail and little Liam that they were now his priority. On arriving at his mansion, Daniel was greeted by the butler, Samuel, a middle-aged man who had worked with him for over 2 decades. Samuel knew him well and immediately noticed that something had changed in his boss. Good morning, Mr. Harrington, said Samuel, inclining his head slightly. Is everything all right with you and Miss Abigail and the baby? Daniel entered, still carrying the weight of the last few weeks, but with determination in his gaze. Samuel, yes, we're all fine and Liam is getting better every day. Now I need your help. I want everything here to be perfect for the arrival of my daughter and grandson. I want you to prepare a room for them, but not just any room. I want it to be special, full of love and care. Samuel, surprised, hid a small smile. Of course, Mr. Harrington. How would you like it done? Daniel began to walk through the hall of the mansion, his hands in his pockets as he thought. Abigail's room should be cozy, nothing too over the top. Soft colors, something that makes her feel at home. For Liam, I want a beautiful crib, baby furniture and toys. Everything he needs. Hire a decorator. But I want to see everything myself. I don't want anything to seem impersonal. Samuel nodded. Understood, sir. May I suggest that the garden team prepare a special area too? Perhaps something where she can relax with the baby. Daniel paused, reflecting. He had never thought about how small details could make a difference. Great idea. Do it. And Samuel, when they get here, I want all the employees to welcome them with respect and affection. Abigail needs to know that this is her place too. Samuel nodded again, seeing something he had never seen in Daniel before, a softness, a love that had previously seemed hidden behind the rigid facade of a businessman. The next few days were a whirlwind. Daniel got personally involved in organizing the room, something he had never done before in his life. He chose the furniture, the curtains, and even the baby clothes. When the decorator suggested a maritime theme for Liam's room, Daniel accepted, imagining his grandson surrounded by small boats, fish, and starfish. "I want him to feel safe here," said Daniel, as he inspected every detail. Every day, Daniel returned to the hospital and went home to see if the room was ready. A fortnight later, Abigail was finally discharged. She was stronger, although she still felt vulnerable. The doctors had said that Liam was stable, but still needed constant monitoring at home. Abigail went to the ICU for the last time in that hospital to hold her son before they left. She took him carefully in her arms, feeling the light weight of his little body against her chest. The machines and tubes had now been replaced by a portable monitor and a small oxygen mask. Abigail looked at the baby with a shaky smile. "It's time to go home, my love," she said, kissing his forehead. Daniel appeared beside her, holding the baby carriage he had brought himself. He looked at Abigail, noticing the mixture of relief and nervousness on her face. "Now we'll be together more than ever. Are we going to start a new life?" he said, with a small smile. Abigail looked at him, still skeptical, but this time there was something different. Maybe, just maybe, he was really trying. When they arrived at the mansion, Abigail was silent as the car drove down the long stone path that led to the main entrance. She had never been back there since she left home years ago. The grandeur of the place seemed even greater, more intimidating. "I don't know if I can do it, Dad," she murmured, holding Liam tightly. "This house brings back so many memories." Daniel touched her hand. "Abigail, this is your home now, and it always will be. Trust me." When they entered, Abigail was greeted by Samuel and all the staff, who applauded softly. Flowers decorated the hall, and there was a warm atmosphere that she never associated with the mansion. Daniel guided her upstairs. He stopped in front of a door and opened it. "This is your room." Abigail entered slowly, and the sight left her speechless. The room was perfect. The walls were soft shades of blue and white, and Liam's crib was surrounded by small details that showed care. Mobiles, plush toys, and even a small blanket with his name embroidered on it. She looked at her father, her eyes full of tears. "You did all this?" Daniel nodded. "I wanted you to know that this is where you and Liam belong. You'll never be alone again, Abigail." She began to cry, unable to contain her emotions. For the first time in a long time, she felt that maybe she could trust him again. As she put Liam in his crib for the first time, Daniel watched, his heart full of gratitude. He knew it would be a long road, but this moment was the start of something new, something he would never allow to be destroyed. The morning began quietly at the Harrington mansion. The sun streamed in through the huge windows of the room Daniel had prepared for Abigail and Liam. Abigail was on the sofa next to the crib, watching her son sleep. It was a rare moment of peace, and she felt grateful to finally be able to take Liam home and have him stable. However, in another corner of the house, Daniel was in his office, trying to hide what he was really feeling. The tiredness had been growing for weeks, and he knew something was wrong. He felt a pain in his chest, something he initially attributed to the stress of the last few weeks, but which was now becoming impossible to ignore. When he tried to stand up, he felt dizzy and almost fell over. Samuel, who was organizing papers in the next room, heard the sound of something being knocked over. He ran into the office and found Daniel sitting in his chair, his hand on his chest, sweating and panting. "Mr. Harrington!" exclaimed Samuel, kneeling down next to his boss. "Are you all right?" Daniel shook his head slightly, unable to answer. "Samuel, and call an ambulance," he managed to say, his voice weak. Samuel quickly picked up the phone and called the emergency service, describing the situation urgently. He knew that Daniel had been pushing himself too hard in recent days, ignoring clear signs that his health was deteriorating. The ambulance arrived within minutes, and the paramedics rushed in, assessing the situation. Daniel was placed on a stretcher and taken into the vehicle. While they checked his vital signs, one of the doctors, noticing the tension on Daniel's face, tried to reassure him. "We're here to help you, Mr. Harrington. We're going to take care of you," said the doctor. But Daniel couldn't think for himself. He held the doctor's hand tightly, his eyes watering. "I can't die now," he said, his voice choking. "Please, do everything you can. I have a daughter and a grandson. They need me more than ever." The doctor hesitated for a moment, visibly touched by the emotion in Daniel's voice. He put his hand on the patient's shoulder. "We'll do our best, but you have to trust us, Mr. Harrington." Daniel closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. He wasn't afraid of dying himself. His fear was of leaving Abigail and Liam before fulfilling the promise he had made to himself. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Abigail was in the living room with Liam, having no idea what was going on. Samuel rushed in, but hesitated before speaking. He knew that the news would shake Abigail to the core. "Miss Abigail," he said, trying to remain calm, "I need to talk to you." She looked at Samuel, frowning. "What's wrong? Has something happened? Is it something with Liam?" "No, little Liam is fine," Samuel replied. "But Mr. Harrington was taken to the hospital. He was ill this morning." Abigail felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. "What? My father? What's happened? Is he all right?" "We don't know yet, miss. He asked us to call an ambulance and the doctors came quickly. But I don't have any more information. He's on his way to hospital now." Tears began to stream down Abigail's face. Even after everything that had happened between them, the thought of losing her father hit her like a blow. She looked at Liam, sleeping peacefully in his crib, and felt a wave of guilt for not being able to rush to the hospital at that moment. I can't leave him," she said, looking at her son. Samuel, sensing her distress, put his hand on Abigail's shoulder. "He'll understand, Miss Abigail. Mr. Harrington knows that Liam needs you. But there's something I think you should see." She looked at Samuel, confused. "What do you mean?" "Come with me," he said, leading her to Daniel's office. In the office, Samuel opened a locked drawer in the desk and took out an old wooden box. He placed it carefully on the table and opened it. Abigail, intrigued, looked inside. The box was full of papers, photographs, and small objects. At the top was a pile of old drawings. Abigail picked them up, immediately recognizing the childish features. "These are my drawings," she said, her voice low and excited. "Yes, miss. Mr. Harrington kept them all. He always said they were his most precious possessions," Samuel replied. Abigail leafed through the drawings, each one bringing back memories of her childhood. Among them, there was one in particular that made her stop. It was a drawing of her and her father, holding hands with the words, "I love you, Daddy," scrawled in the corner. She couldn't remember when she had done it, but just knowing that he had kept it made her deeply emotional. At the bottom of the box there was a pile of letters, all carefully folded. Abigail took one of them and opened it. It was handwritten in Daniel's firm handwriting. "Dear Abigail, I know I've made a lot of mistakes, and I know you may never forgive me. But I want you to know that I think of you every day. There isn't a moment when I don't regret letting you go. I didn't know how to be a good father, but that was never your fault. I wanted to be better. I wanted you to know that I love you." Abigail closed her eyes, the tears flowing freely now. Every letter she read was a testament to Daniel's regret, a record of years in which he had struggled to find the right words, but never had the courage to send them. Samuel looked at Abigail with a sad smile. "He always spoke of you, Miss Abigail. There wasn't a day when he didn't mention how much he missed you. He thought it was too late to put things right, but he never stopped trying." Abigail held the last letter in her hand, pressing it against her chest. For so long she had thought that her father simply didn't care. But there, among those drawings and letters, was proof that he loved her, even if he didn't know how to show it. At the hospital, Daniel was being taken to the emergency room. His heart was in danger, but the determination in his eyes was clear. He couldn't give up now. He needed to get back to Abigail and Liam. "Doctor, do everything you can," he ordered, his voice full of emotion. "I can't leave them now. I promised I'd be there for them." The doctors exchanged glances, touched by Daniel's words. They knew they were dealing with more than just a physical problem. This man was fighting for his family. At the mansion, Abigail held Liam in her arms, tears still streaming down her face. She looked at the baby and murmured, "I thought I was alone, but he's always been with me, even from afar." And as the clock ticked down the hours, one thing became clear to Abigail. She was ready to forgive her father if he had the chance to come back. The afternoon in the mansion was silent. Abigail was in Liam's room, cradling her newborn son with a mixture of love and concern. Every time she looked at his little face, She felt her heart squeeze, thinking of his father who was in hospital fighting for his life. She could still hear Samuel's words. "Mr. Harrington is fighting. He will come back to you." Despite this, doubts and fear continued to surround her. What if there wasn't time? What if she lost her father before she could really rebuild the bond that was beginning to blossom between them? "You're so small, Liam," she murmured, looking down at the baby. "But you've already brought so much love to our family. I just wish he was here to see it. He fought so hard for us. I don't know what I'll do if he doesn't come back." Emma entered the room with a worried expression. She hesitated before speaking, as if weighing up whether to say something or not. "Miss Abigail, Mr. Harrington is coming back for you. He's stronger than he looks. But I know it's hard, and that you need someone to talk to about all this." Abigail turned to the maid, who had known her since she was a little girl, and sighed. "Emma, the truth is I don't even know how I feel. For years I thought he didn't care, and now he cares so much. It's hard to understand." Emma sat down in the nearby armchair, watching Abigail with an affectionate gaze. "When you were little, he used to spend hours talking about how brilliant you were. He used to say that your smile was the only sparkle worth more than any fortune. I know he made a lot of mistakes, but his love for you never diminished." Abigail looked at Emma, tears filling her eyes. "Why didn't he ever say that? Why didn't he ever show that love when I needed it most?" "Sometimes the strong men who seem to have everything are the most fragile inside," Emma said softly. "He didn't know how to express himself. And now, I think his biggest fear is not having enough time to show how much he's changed." Emma's words hit Abigail like a blow. She stood up and walked over to Liam's crib, leaning over to touch his little face. "If he comes back to us, Emma, I promise I won't waste another moment. I want him to know that I forgive him, that he's important to us." At the hospital, Daniel was awake, but still connected to machines that monitored his heart. He stared at the ceiling, his thoughts dominated by Abigail and Liam. The sound of the machines seemed a constant reminder of his fragility, but he knew he couldn't give up. One of the doctors came in and checked Daniel's vital signs. "How are you feeling, Mr. Harrington?" "Like someone who desperately needs to get home," Daniel replied, his voice hoarse. The doctor smiled gently. "You're a determined man. That's good. Your recovery is going well, but you'll need rest and care over the next few weeks." Daniel nodded, closing his eyes for a moment. "Thank you, doctor. But I want you to know that I'm not just fighting for myself. I'm fighting because for the first time in years, I have something to live for, my daughter and my grandson. They need me, and I need them." The doctor touched Daniel's shoulder with empathy. "These are the reasons that keep people alive. You'll get back to them. Keep fighting." At the mansion, the wait seemed endless to Abigail. She spent the night beside Liam's crib, watching her son sleep while her own tears silently flowed. Childhood memories flooded her, bringing back flashes of the few moments when her father was really there. When he taught her to ride a bike, when he fixed her favorite toy, when he carried her in his arms after a fall. She realized that, even with all the absences, there were small gestures that showed Daniel's love. He didn't know how to be the father she needed, but he never stopped loving her. 2 days later, the news finally arrived. Daniel was stable and would be discharged soon. Samuel was the first to inform Abigail, who almost fell over with relief when she heard the words. "Is he all right?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes, Miss Abigail. He'll still need care, but he's out of danger." Tears began to stream down Abigail's face, this time of relief. She ran into the bedroom, took Liam in her arms and held her son against her chest. "Your grandfather is coming home, my love. He's coming back to us." The next morning, Daniel returned to the mansion. He was visibly weaker but determined. When the car stopped in front of the main entrance, he saw Abigail and Liam waiting for him on the stairs. Abigail was holding the baby in her arms, her eyes shining with emotion. Daniel got out of the car with Samuel's help. When he looked at Abigail, she walked up to him quickly, without hesitation, and hugged him gently. "I thought I was going to lose you, Dad," she said, her voice breaking. "I promised I'd come back, didn't I?" he replied, trying to smile even though he was overcome with emotion. Abigail placed Liam in Daniel's arms. The baby seemed so small and fragile, but at the same time, so full of life. Daniel held him carefully, looking at the little face. "Liam, you're the reason I'm here today," he said, tears falling freely. And your mother? She's the reason my life has meaning again. Abigail smiled through her tears, holding her father's arm. And you, Dad. You're the grandfather he's going to know, and the father I always knew I loved. And at that moment, in the soft glow of the morning, the Harrington family found a new chance to be complete. The mistakes of the past didn't matter, because love and forgiveness bound them together unbreakably. Did you like the story? Comment below with the name of the father who deserves a heart, and I'll leave a heart for you in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like and share this video with someone you love. And there are more heartwarming stories waiting for you. Click on the video that's appearing on your screen right now and keep getting emotional with us. Thank you for watching. See you next time.